Hello, this is a video on the great American poet Walt Whitman. Whitman was definitely one of the greatest of the American poets. This was because Whitman upheld the values of American national consciousness, such as democracy and individualism. Whitman was the son of a carpenter, and he received only a few years of formal education. He became a school teacher and a journalist. And the last 20 years of his life, he spent in a wheelchair because of a paralytic stroke. Whitman was inspired by Emerson and expressed in his poems the spirit of literary nationalism that Emerson talked about in lectures like the American Scholar. And Whitman wrote a special kind of poetry, long lines of operatic singing that literally gives you goosebumps when somebody recites it. And he was the pioneer of free verse. Whitman wrote a lot about physical life, but through physical life, he presented spirituality that is rooted in the body. As the title of his most important collection of poems denotes, he gave importance to ordinary life. He gave importance to the common man. Leaves of Grass is the title of his major book. All the other small collections that he had published all eventually became the part of Leaves of Grass. And he glorifies the spiritual life of the ordinary people. And Leaves of Grass was published in 1855 on a very momentous day, July the 4th, which is the Independence Day of America. The title Leaves of Grass is taken from Emerson's poem called The Poet. The title is ironic because leaves means pages and grass means inferior poetic efforts. Whitman is titling his own poems in a self-deprecatory manner. The first edition was printed in Brooklyn. It was self-published. And the book underwent lots of revisions and additions in the subsequent years of his lifetime. Emerson was a very major influence. Whitman was also influenced by his own travels through the American frontier. America was changing drastically at this time. For many reasons. The frontier was moving west, and the transatlantic railroad was built, which led to the westward expansion. Emerson praised Whitman and said that Leaves of Grass is the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed to the world. There are many important poems in Leaves of Grass. One important poem is Song of Myself. It is a 52-part long poem where Whitman celebrates selfhood. There were many versions. In the 1855 edition, there was no title. The next year, it was called A Poem by Walt Whitman, and then it was called Walt Whitman. The 1892 edition of this poem begins, I celebrate myself and sing myself. And this is a poem that powerfully expresses the voice of the I, or selfhood, and also fearlessly depicts human sexuality. He also touches upon themes of slavery, women's rights, etc. in this poem. It is a poem that sings for humanity. I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. This is how he talks about myself. Like Emerson, Whitman was also influenced by Western thought. You know, the idea of Advaita. We are all one. That idea is there running through all of Whitman's poems. A group of his poems are about the Civil War, and also about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Very famous among them is O Captain, My Captain, which is a famous poem that is recited by students across the world. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed. That is another famous poem that talks about Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln was, by the way, assassinated in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, which was on the issue of slavery. Lilacs is a poem in 3 parts. It's a non-conventional pastoral elegy. In the first part, the poet says, the last time lilacs bloomed in his dooryard, he saw a powerful great star fall in the western sky. That represents Lincoln, of course. Now, every spring when lilacs bloom, it fills his heart with gloom. And the color of the lilac reminds him of crucifixion and sacrifice. Lincoln's death is like a sacrifice that he has made for the sake of humanity. And now, every time lilacs bloom, the poet breaks off a sprig of lilac in remembrance of Lincoln. In the second part of the poem, he describes the mournful journey of Lincoln's coffin from Washington, D.C. to Lincoln's hometown in Springfield in Illinois, where he would be buried. Of course, Lincoln actually died long before this poem was written, but he's remembering the incident as if it happened today. The poet tells the dead president, I will give you my sprig of lilac. And the death of Lincoln is thus associated with fresh life. Lincoln's death is hope for many generations to come. And it becomes a sane and sacred death in this age of madness. At that time, a hermit thrush is singing, and this appears to the poet to be a mourning for the dead. And he says he will decorate the coffin of Lincoln with the pictures of ordinary people, unlike the flowers that are used in the pastoral tradition. And in the third part of the poem, he says he's feeling like he has gained a sacred knowledge of death. He's feeling as if he understands that Lincoln's death is not a loss, but a gain, a sacrifice. The dead people do not suffer. It is only the living people who suffer. And sometimes the lives of the living people change because of what has happened in the past, because of a sacrifice that has happened in the past. The poet is now feeling an emotional complication, because he understands that this death brings ultimate truth. He understands life and death in a new manner. He understands that Lincoln's death has taken him towards immortality, because it is going to be a great age that dawns because of Lincoln's death. Another very famous poem is Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking. It is a poem that belongs to birth of the poet genre, which is a romantic genre used by Wordsworth, etc. The poet is a young boy. He is on the Paumanok Beach or Long Island, where he's seeing 2 mockingbirds nesting. And one day, the female bird disappears. And then the male bird cries out to the wind. It looks to the poet or the boy that the male bird is saying, I wait and wait till you blow my mate to me. He feels like this is the song that the male bird sings. And the bird's cries touches the boy's heart. The boy asks nature, the boy asks sea, the ocean, the waves, what is the word that defines human suffering? And the ocean, the back and forth movement of the ocean, the back and forth movement of the waves, which is like the rocking of a cradle. It tells the boy, death. Everything is defined by death. But we are all part of a grand scheme. Our life does not just end with death. We are part of humanity. People will be reborn in other ways. This is the theme in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry also. This interconnectedness of human beings is there in When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed as well. The bird is a symbol of the natural world. The sea symbolizes the cycle of life and death. And the poet is born. The boy transforms into a poet. The boy transforms into a mature adult and into a poet. This is also a transformation from a literal experience to a spiritual experience. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is another poem of the same theme. Simple things of everyday life are like objective correlatives or like epiphanies that suddenly reveal to the poet big, grand schemes of the universe. One day, the poet is at Brooklyn, at the ferry, and he's watching the crowd gathered there. So many people making the crossing. And he thinks of all the people who have already crossed and all the people who will eventually cross after him. This is not the first time humanity is crossing the ferry. In 100 years, more people will see the same river, the same ebb and flow of the tide. And he understands that this scene that he sees at the ferry is part of a whole. The individual as part of humanity. Despite the differences in time and place, the poet is remembering generations who have gone before him and generations who will come after him. He recalls all the sights at the ferry that he has seen, which humanity has seen before and after him. The river is a symbol of life itself, ever flowing, forever appearing the same but changing every day, every moment. It is like humanity. The poet feels united with the other men, with the rest of humanity, in not only the joys of life, but also in the occasional darkness of the human soul, which he experiences like others. And the poet now draws closer to the reader. Like the reader, he's also experiencing the same things. It is as if he can see the reader. It might as well be that the poet is looking at us, even though we cannot see him. The poet becomes one with the reader in a supreme moment of self-realization. And then there are great apostrophes that follow. An apostrophe to the river, an apostrophe to Brooklyn, an apostrophe to life itself. The poem closes with a mystic tone when the poet feels that the whole world is within him and wishes that all the variety of the world, the diversity of the world, the myriad phenomena of the natural and human world should continue to flourish as one soul. This brings us to another poem, Passage to India. The year is 1869. Two engineering marvels changed the history of humanity in that year, 1869. First, there was the building of the transcontinental railroad in America. Across America, the transcontinental railroad that made journey into the interior of the Western America possible. After this, there was the building of the Suez Canal. Without going round Africa, it was now possible for the Europeans to come directly to the Asian countries like India. Whitman is praising not only these engineering technological achievements, he is also praising the human mind, the thought behind it that made such things possible. A vision of the spiritual regeneration of the human race is what he sees here. The greatness of humanity, the great achievements of humanity in terms of technology that may bring into being an age of brotherhood and peace. That is what he envisages the future to be. He was wrong. It was an age of war and tearing one another apart that came, but that vision that Whitman has is beautiful. A group of his poems that came later is also called Drum Taps. There was also sequel to Drum Taps. And all of this in his lifetime became part of Leaves of Grass itself. There are 53 poems about the Civil War in Drum Taps. Whitman experienced life in its fullest. He loved the physicalities of life. He had a great vision for America. He was an amazing poet. I can tell you that. An amazing poet who wrote in a unique style. You should read his poems. The way he writes long lines, all beginning with anaphora, the same words repeated at the beginning of lines. The grand, tone that he evokes in his language. It is amazing. He is definitely one of the greatest American poets and one of the most favorite of the poets that I've ever read. So that is about Walt Whitman.